continue our Gemara on Kuf Yud Beis, Amud Beis of Sanhedrin. We are top of page 112 in Sanhedrin. We're discussing the law of the Ir HaNidachas, what we term the castaway city, the city that was, through bad leadership, redirected from the service of Hashem and enticed to go serve idols. And we discussed the uniqueness of this law, the improbability, if not according to at least one opinion, never actually happened because of how difficult it is to actually qualify to be such a city, as we explained at length. And now we're discussing the hypothetical of what happens to the property in that city. We began that discussion already. Specifically, the law is that the property of this city, of this would-be city, has to be destroyed. And we pointed out from the verse already that when we say the property has to be destroyed, it's not all the property, it depends on the scenario. And we discussed property of the righteous, and that the property of the righteous that's in the city gets destroyed with the city, property of the righteous who live in the city, but the property is not in the city, they own property somewhere else. That property I don't just mean land, I mean anything they own, any objects. So if a righteous who lives in the city has property or goods outside of the city, does not get destroyed, whilst the wicked gets destroyed completely, whether in the city or out of the city. We discussed the issue of shaitel, wigs, and whether it's considered an article of clothing or whether it's considered a property. And if it's an article of clothing and it belongs to the righteous, then they can take it out. If it's considered property, then it gets destroyed if it's in the city. And we discussed various details along those lines. And one of the things you pointed out was that from the verse it says that the property belonging to the city or belonging to the inhabitants of the city is destroyed, which would exclude anything in the city that belongs to heaven. Heaven meaning it belongs to the temple in some regard. That does not get destroyed. Now the Gemara is now going to discuss the details of that law, the details of this idea that property in the city belonging to the temple does not get destroyed, and to what degree does it belong to the temple, what's it been consecrated for, and what happens to it if it's not being destroyed. Can it be offered in the temple or not, and etc. That's the Gemara's discussion presently. So we're at the top of the page, and it's the first word. So the Mishnah quote, first the Gemara quotes the Mishnah, as it always does, and the Mishnah is, V'akdesha sheba yiftu, consecrated stuff, property or things that have been consecrated in this city, consecrated to the temple. Yiftu is to be redeemed, which means as follows. The process of redemption is basically as follows. We'll get more details as we go along, but the basic process is like this. If I had an animal that I designated to be brought on the altar, this is not true of every single offering. There are lots of rules for in each offering has a separate rule, what type of offering, what type of animal. That's not for now, but the basic principle is if I had an animal that I've consecrated to be offered on the altar in the temple, so that thing has become holy. That's the word holy means. The word kadusha, kadosh in Hebrew, means sanctified, or in this context, consecrated. It's been designated to the temple. And once it's designated to the temple, I can't have any benefit from it because it belongs to the temple. But to what degree? Because it hasn't been brought yet. It hasn't been slaughtered. No actionable item has been done to this animal in the offering process, which would make it really actually holy. But it's just my consecration that did it. It's just my decision to donate this animal for the temple. So the process of redemption, again, depending on what type of offering it is and what kind of how I consecrated it, again, not for now. Some of that we'll get into. The process is essentially, let's say the cow is worth $100. So I take $100 and this $100 now becomes consecrated to the temple instead in replacement of the animal. The animal becomes my property now. So I kind of bought back my animal from the temple, and then that $100 is used to buy another offering, say, for the temple. This often happens depending, again, what kind of animal, what kind of offering, or what kind of animal, but it could happen, for example, if my offering became invalid to be offered in the temple because it got a blemish, let's say. So now only perfect, unblemished animals can be offered on the altar, and this one became blemished. So what do I do with this animal? It's blemished, so I can't offer it on the altar, but I've consecrated already to heaven. So what do? I redeem it. I take the value of that animal, buy another animal that is good, and that animal gets offered in the temple. Again, I keep on saying this again and again because it's very important to know this, that Depends what kind of animal and depends what kind of offering, but it's a general principle of yiftu, that it should be redeemed. So I'm just going to use the word going forward, redeemed, and that's what I mean. Taking cash to buy back the animal from the fact that it's been consecrated to the temple, and then that money is used to replace the animal that I just redeemed. That's the basic principle. So let's see. Tan Rabbanan, I say, just taught. We'll skip the parentheses there. It seems that shouldn't be there. Kachim, things that have been consecrated. Let's break it down. Kachim is beyach, stuff that has been consecrated to be offered on the altar. So animals that belong to members of this city, or actually of the wicked people in the city. So the wicked people who served idols consecrated some animal, or one of them, or a few of them, consecrated an animal to be offered on the altar specifically. So Yamusu, this animal dies. So let's get this clear. It dies, but not put to death, because put to death would mean that it's being treated like the rest of the property of the Ir HaNidachas. Any property belonging to this castaway city has to be destroyed. Animals being killed. This animal doesn't belong to the city. It's been consecrated to the temple, so it has to die. So it cannot be killed because it doesn't belong to the city. But on the other hand, it cannot be offered on the altar because it came from such a terrible place. As we'll see soon, the reasons for that. So it can't be offered on the altar because it comes from this terrible city and it comes from wicked people. And on the other hand, it can't be put to death because if it's put to death, that's treating it like the rest of the property of the city. And this is not. This is property of the altar. So what happens? It's left to die. What we do is we put it under conditions so that it speeds up its natural process of dying. Essentially, it's put into a confined space and fed not such healthy food, and that way it dies within a certain amount of time, but it's, as it were, a natural death, but we're kind of helping the process along that it dies of a natural causes. So it's not killed, because that would be like treating it as if it were just ordinary property of the city, which gets killed, and this is not ordinary property of the city, this belongs to the altar. But it cannot actually be brought on the altar because it came from such a terrible place. It came from this castaway city, and therefore it's coached to its natural death. Okay, so that's kachim mizbeach. That's stuff that's been consecrated to on the altar. Now, kachim bedek habayis, things that have been consecrated not to be offered as offerings on the altar, but they've been consecrated as upkeep of the temple. There is a special fund to keep the temple running. There's maintenance that has to go into it. There is cleaning and fixing and fixing things that are broken, and it's a big operation to keep a building like that going with all of the functions that go along with it. That's called bedek habayis, upkeep of the house. Literally, bedek habayis means upkeep of the house. So if I've donated, or a wicked person in that city, has donated an animal, that this animal, or whatever it is, not necessarily an animal, anything he owns, donated it to upkeep of the temple. Charity. So now the actual property itself doesn't necessarily go to the temple. It's the value of that thing. So this is yiftu. Here we redeem it. The value of what it cost gets given to the bedek habayis, gets given to the upkeep of the house, and the rest of the property, whatever that thing was, whatever that object was that was donated, that gets destroyed because it no longer has the consecrated holy element anymore because it's been redeemed. It's been exchanged for the cash value. Okay. The truma, of course, is the requisite donations that have to be given to the kohen, the priest. It's produce, and this produce, again, cannot be destroyed as part of the castaway city because it doesn't belong to the city, it belongs to the kohen. But the kohen can't eat it because it came from such a terrible place. So what happens to it? Yirkavu, we let it rot. Meiser sheni, the kisvei hakodesh. Meiser sheni is certain tithe during a certain year. There's a 7-year cycle, right? There's a sabbatical year, a 7-year cycle of growing of the land. So during certain years, a certain percentage of produce has to be taken by the owner to Jerusalem and eaten there. So this has a semi-consecrated status, because on the one hand, it belongs to the person who produced it, because that person gets to eat it, just like you would any the rest of the produce. But it's not fully his, because he has to actually eat it under Jerusalem. So there's a certain, it's an in-between state. And therefore, what do we do with it? We can't destroy it with the rest of the city, because that would be destroying property of the city, and this doesn't belong fully to the people of the city. It belongs somewhat to heaven, because it has to be taken to Jerusalem under the law of Ma'aser Sheni, of the second tithe, as it's called. And likewise, Kisvei Kodesh, holy articles, so a Torah scroll or tefillin and mezuzahs, you can't destroy it. It's got God's name in it. So what do you do with it? On the other hand, you can't use these things because it came from this terrible place, and therefore Yignuzu, these get buried. Okay. Rabbi Shimon's of the view. So that's one view. The second view is, and the Gemara can explain later what the reason for this is, that no, all of the items above are, as we'll see soon, redeemed. Because all of these items became holy by virtue of the person making it holy. And because the person made it holy, but it wasn't always holy, it's still the person himself still retains some sort of ownership on that thing. And because the person retains ownership on that thing, it qualifies as objects belonging or property belonging to the castaway city, and therefore gets destroyed with the city if it's redeemed for the cash value to go wherever it has to go. And therefore, what are the things that are excluded as not being part of the property of the city but belonging to the heaven? Only things that are consecrated unto heaven by its very birth. Namely, the verse reads with respect to the law of the castaway city in terms of describing the property that has to be destroyed. It reads as follows: Behemta, its animals need to be destroyed, v'lo behemas b'chor u'maiser, and not animals of the firstborn and the 10th animal. Now, these two, firstborn, the moment it's born, belongs to heaven, never belonged to the individual who lives in the castaway city. Likewise, the 10th animal, even though it doesn't necessarily happen right away, it's unique in that it doesn't happen by consecration. It's not an elective. You consecrate an animal to the temple, which is what was described earlier in the first opinion. Rabbi Shimon is saying the 10th animal basically just simply there's 10 animals walk through like a post, and the 10th animal gets kind of painted, and then that gets consecrated automatically to heaven. So because it happens automatically, and therefore the individual doesn't have any ownership or right to it at all, that is the kind of animal that's excluded from being burnt with the rest of the city. Rabbi Shimon is basically stating only these two type of items or animals that belong to heaven, in that their consecration or designation to the temple happens automatically without the choice of the individual, and therefore the individual kind of doesn't own it at all. That's the kind of stuff that doesn't get destroyed. But the other animals described earlier, where you choose to donate it to the temple, those are redeemed, and so it would seem Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Yeah, so more details in Rabbi Shimon's opinion coming later, but that's the general outline. Okay, so this is, shlala, and the verse says, its property gets destroyed, the property belonging to this castaway city, prat, this is the exclusion of, this is all Rabbi Shimon speaking, l'kesef ha'kodesh, to money, money that belongs to the temple, the kesef meiser, and money of meiser of the tithe, that already doesn't belong to the individual. And therefore cannot get destroyed. The city belongs to the holy, as it were, belongs to the temple or to wherever that tithe is going to be going. Okay. So this is the end of the Mishnaic age text, with the Gemara brought to elaborate on the Mishnah, because the Mishnah just said that the holy gets redeemed, but which type of holy, when do they get redeemed? And now we have the details. We have one opinion that differentiates between animals that were consecrated to the altar. Those get redeemed. Those can't get redeemed because it already belongs to heaven. Those have to die of natural causes, but we speed up the process. Things that have been donated for the upkeep of the temple, that stuff gets redeemed. Trumos, requisite donations to the Kohen, and Ma'aser Sheni, that stuff has to rot. Ma'aser Sheni is the tithe that the individual Jew brings up to eat in the temple, to eat in Jerusalem during certain years of the Shemitah cycle, and as well as holy scrolls. That stuff gets buried. That's the first view. Rabbi Shimon says, no, the only type of animals that are included in the destruction of this castaway city is animals that were automatically become holy. Namely, Bechor, the firstborn animal that gets donated automatically, and likewise, the 10th animal walking through the count, when you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you have the animals filed by you under this archway, and the 10th animal automatically gets, a city, a Kodesh, the 10th automatically becomes consecrated to heaven. And those are the stuff that are excluded from being destroyed with the city. And likewise, money of tithe and money belonging to the temple, that stuff does not get destroyed with the city. That's Rabbi Shimon's view. Okay, so we're going to put Rabbi Shimon's view on hold. That's going to come later. But now let's analyze the first view, which made differentiation between animals consecrated to be offered in the temple and animals consecrated to upkeep of the temple. Animals consecrated to the altar, that has to die of natural death, and we move the process along, but we don't kill it, because killing it would mean we're destroying it like the property of the castaway city, which it's not. It belongs to the altar. It cannot be brought in the altar for reasons that we'll describe in a moment, and therefore it's let to die. So the first thing we're going to do is discuss, why can't it be brought on the altar? Why can't you redeem it and then just use that money to buy something on the altar? Why can't you redeem that animal and use the money to buy something that you can later put on the altar? So says the Gemara as follows. Amar Mar, master or sir or rabbi, said earlier, meaning the first opinion, Hoyuba Kachim, if it had holy consecrated animals, Kachim is Beach, and they've been consecrated to the altar, they've been consecrated and designated by the wicked people of the city to be offered on the altar. Yamusu, have to die of natural causes, but we help it along in its death by confining it to such an area and feeding it unhealthy food so that it dies on its own. But we cannot kill it, and we cannot bring it on to the altar. Says the Gemara of Amai, why should it die? Amai Yamusu, why should it die? Yiru, let this animal pasture, meaning we shouldn't put it into the confined space and help it along till its death. Let it pasture. Tavu, to the point that they become disgusting, meaning, let's say it bumps its head and gets a blemish, and now it's disgusting for the altar. It can no longer be offered on the altar because it's no longer a wholesome animal. And then the yimchuru, sell it, because it's no longer capable of being offered of its own. It's not incapable of being offered because it's part of the castaway city. It's incapable of being offered even if it didn't belong to the castaway city because it got a blemish. And then the yiplu demei l'dava, and the money left from that animal will become a donation to the altar, or become a donation to the temple. What it's saying is, why does the temple have to lose out on the money of that, or the value of that animal? If we're worried about the money, if we're worried about this animal being offered on the altar because it came from such a negative place, or because the wicked actually is going to be dying, it's actually more accurate. The reason why the animal itself cannot be offered on the altar is because the owners are dying, and you don't offer offerings for dead people. The owners are dying because they're wicked people who came from the castaway city. So the animal can't be brought. Fine, we got that. You don't want to redeem it because that's too actively taking money to be used for the temple, or maybe it can't even be redeemed, depending on what kind of offering it is. But if it's put under a condition where we are forced to not take it to the altar because it got a blemish, then we can sell it and use the money for the temple. Why should the temple lose out on the value of that animal? And therefore, the Gemara is asking, and this is a trick. This is a kind of a tactic. It's used in other scenarios, under other conditions. Let the animal graze. It's going to take some time, but it'll naturally get a blemish. Once it gets the blemish, you sell it and use the money for the temple. So why do we have to help it along till its death and completely get no use out of the animal for the temple? So the Gemara now offers two reasons. Rabbi Yochanan says, the verse reads in Mishlei, Perek Chelek, Pasuk Zayin, that is, Proverbs, chapter 21, verse 27, Zevach Reshoyim Toyeva. The offering of the wicked are repulsive. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says, this applies even to money that has come as the result of such an animal. Any offering which originates from the wicked, this person who came from the castaway city who's being put to death for worshiping idols, cannot be used on the altar or in the temple because it is disgusting. So even if it's not the animal itself, if it's been redeemed, even if it's done by the tactic of being redeemed because it's been left to grace to the point that it got a blemish, now we're being forced to redeem it, even that money is disgusting, and therefore the temple cannot receive any benefit from the offering consecrated by that wicked person, and thus it has to be left to die. That's Rabbi Yochanan's view. Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan's brother-in-law and Chavrusa, we mentioned him a number of times. Omar, he says no. There's a different reason why we can't use it. Because mamun bailamun. Because even though this animal has been consecrated for the purposes of being offered on the altar, it still belongs to the owners, at least to some degree. And because it belongs to the owners, it therefore deserves to be destroyed as part of the rest of the city. But at the same time, it's not exactly ownership, and therefore can't be, because it's already been consecrated for the temple, and therefore it can't actually be killed with the rest of the property of the castaway city. In other words, the Shakish is saying that these animals that have been consecrated to the temple, to the altar, are not 100% in anybody's possession. On the one hand, they're consecrated to the temple and therefore can't be used for any other purposes. On the other hand, it still belongs to some degree to the owners. And if it's in between, it partially belongs to the owner, and therefore, because it partially belongs to the owner, in this case, it should be burnt with the rest of the city. But on the other hand, and therefore can't be brought to the altar, even the money can't be brought to the altar because it belongs to the castaway city, because anything that belongs to the castaway city has got to be destroyed. On the other hand, we can't actually bring it to the and therefore can't be brought to the altar because it belongs partially to the people of the city. On the other hand, it can't be destroyed with the rest of the property of the people of that city because it's already been consecrated to the temple. So it's in limbo, and thus it has to die. Now, the burden of proof is on Reish Lakish to demonstrate that the owners actually retain some ownership of this animal. I mean, seemingly you would say it's consecrated to the altar, it belongs to the altar. Reish Lakish is saying, no, it's consecrated to the altar, yes, but it still belongs somewhat to the people. And because it belongs somewhat to the people, it should, in theory, be destroyed with the rest of the property of these people in the castaway city. But it can't actually be because it's been consecrated. So to what degree, or how do we know, or where do we demonstrate this notion that it belongs to some degree to the people who consecrated the animal? In this case, being the people of the castaway city. We know it's been consecrated to the temple because it's been consecrated to the temple. But the retaining ownership of the people who made the consecration, in this case, people of the castaway city, we need to demonstrate that. So says the Gemara. And here, what are we talking about? The Kachim, we're talking about consecrated animals, Shechayev Bachar Yusan, where the person who made the dedication, the person who consecrated this animal, took responsibility for this animal. Taking responsibility for this animal means, if I consecrate an animal to the temple, and it dies, am I responsible to replace it, to bring another animal to the altar? Well, if the animal belongs to the altar, doesn't belong to me at all, then the altar lost out. It died in the hands of the altar. Like, in other words, it died under the ownership of the altar. I didn't do anything wrong. I donated it to the temple. It died before it got there. Okay, but it belonged to the temple. The temple lost out. But if I take responsibility for it, which means I'm taking responsibility that if this animal dies, I'm going to replace it. Now, if I'm going to replace it, that means I still have some ownership of it, because if in its death, I have to spend more money on it, because I got to replace it. So it still belongs to me somewhat. Now, who is of the opinion? Now, so this is Reish Lakish saying that we're talking about a person who lives in a castaway city who consecrated a animal to the altar, and because it belongs to the altar, in the sense that it was consecrated to the altar. It can't be destroyed with the rest of castaway. It can't be destroyed with the rest of his property as part of the castaway city. On the other hand, because I took responsibility, because this wicked person from the castaway city took responsibility for that animal, so therefore, which would mean if the animal died, he has to replace it because he took responsibility for it. That means the person who made the consecration still retains some ownership over the animal, and because he retains some ownership of the animal, it ought to, in theory, be destroyed with the rest of his property in the castaway city, and therefore cannot go to the altar. So now it's stuck in the middle. As a result of its consecration to the altar, it can't be destroyed with the rest of the property of the castaway city. But as a result of the fact that he took responsibility for it, and therefore he owns it to some degree, from that perspective, it can't go to the altar, and it has to be destroyed with the city, even if you redeem it for cash, because that cash still belongs to that person. And thus, what do? We can't burn it with the rest of the city because it belongs to the altar. We can't bring it to the altar because it belongs to it belongs to the person of that city. What do? We let it die. This is Reish Lakish's argument. But now the Gemara has to say, you need to have an opinion. Reish Lakish is a scholar of the Gemara's age. He needs to bring an opinion, or at least a proof to the notion from the Mishnaic era. He has to bring a proof to the notion that the person takes responsibility for the animal and thus retains some ownership. And if the Gemara asks, who is that? Rabbi Shimon. This is Rabbi Shimon. The Omar, Rabbi Shimon's of the view, Maman Bailamhu, that animals that have been consecrated to the temple, to the altar, still belong, the value of that still belongs to the owner, the person who consecrated it, in that he's responsible to replace it should it die. This is Rabbi Shimon's view. The Gemara asks, hold on a second. We are here analyzing the first opinion in our text. The first opinion in our text is followed by Rabbi Shimon's view, who disagrees with the first opinion. Now, if Rabbi Shlokish is saying that the first opinion is Reish Lakish because he's the one who says that someone who consecrates an animal to the altar still retains ownership, if that's the case, then Rabbi Shimon is arguing with himself, because the first half is according to Rabbi Shimon, because he's the only one who says that the animal still belongs to the owner who consecrated it, and that's why it can't go either way. It can't be destroyed with the rest of the city because it belongs to the altar, and it can't go to the altar because it belongs to the person. Right? If that only works out according to Rabbi Shimon, then that means the first statement in the Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon, and the second statement also Rabbi Shimon. He's arguing with himself. And that's the Gemara says, how to say Rabbi Shimon from the fact that the second half of the statement belongs to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon, then the first half cannot be Rabbi Shimon. The first opinion cannot be Rabbi Shimon. And here Rabbi Shlokish is explaining the opinion of the first. He's explaining the view of the first opinion in accordance with Rabbi Shimon, who is really the author of the second statement. And it could not be Rabbi Shimon is arguing with himself. Ella, rather, says the Gemara, no. The first half, the first view of the text, which Reish Lakish explained, is referring to consecrated animals that are consecrated to the altar. But the owners who consecrated them still retain some ownership in that they are responsible to replace it if it were to die. And therefore, because it's consecrated to the temple, it can't be destroyed with the rest of the castaway city. But because the original owners retain some ownership, it can't actually be offered to the altar, even if it's been redeemed. Who does this follow? This refers to Elaba Kachim Kalam. It goes with Kachim Kalam. So without getting into the details of all of this, you should just know as follows. With respect to animals that are consecrated to the altar, sacrifices, there are two categories of sacrifices. One is of a higher holiness, Kache Kachim, holy of holy, and one is Kachim Kalim, a lesser degree of sanctity. Kachim Kalim means lighter or lesser degree of holy. Now, Rabbi Shimon's of the view that any animal you offer you consecrate to the altar, you take responsibility, or you can at least take responsibility for it, and therefore you can retain some ownership even though you've consecrated it to the altar. However, there is another view, which is Rabbi Yosef Aglili, who's of the view that says no. But Rabbi Yosef Aglili follows Rabbi Yosef Aglili. The Amar, which Rabbi Yosef Aglili says, Kachim Kalam Mamin Bailamu. Things that are of a lesser degree of holiness, the offerings that are of a lesser degree of holiness, whatever they are, it's not important, but there are certain offerings on the altar that have a lower degree of holiness. Rabbi Yosef Aglili is of the view the owner retains ownership. So let's get this straight, which means like this. The Mishnah the original text had two views. The opening statement was that something that's been consecrated to the altar dies of natural causes. we help it along the process, but it dies in natural causes. The reason why it dies in natural causes is because it cannot be offered on the altar because it belongs to the people of a castaway city, which ought to be destroyed. On the other hand, it can actually be destroyed with the property of the castaway city because it's been consecrated to the temple. So how do we have this mixed ownership? Right? Rabbi Yochanan is of the view that it's nothing to do with mixed ownership. It has to do with the fact that this animal came from a wicked person, and the verse says the offerings of the wicked are disgusting. Even if you redeem it, can't go to the altar. Fine, Rabbi Yochanan's clear. But Ir HaNidachas is of the view that it's because of mixed ownership. Now we need to find some legal grounding for this idea, or some precedent for this idea of mixed ownership. So first we suggested it's Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon is of the view that any animal that's been offered to the altar can have mixed ownership, because the person who consecrated it retained some ownership in the fact that if it died, he had to replace it. But the Gemara rejects that by saying Rabbi Shimon is the second view of the original text, and therefore that cannot be the explanation for the first view of the text. And therefore we found Rabbi Yosef Glili. Rabbi Yosef Glili, who says only certain type of offerings have mixed ownership. The ones of lesser degree, any animal that's been consecrated to the temple on the lesser degree of on the offerings that have a lesser degree of holiness, there's a mixed ownership, and that is the scenario. These kachim kalim, these lesser degree offerings, that's the scenario where the original statement said it has to die of natural death because it has mixed ownership. Now the Gemara asks as follows: Aval kachim. So now, if we've reduced the opening statement of the Mishnah, which is the first view, which now Ir HaNidachas is saying is Rabbi Yosef Glili, is referring to offerings of a lesser degree of holiness, which retains mixed ownership. Partially belongs to the person who consecrated it, in this case the person from the castaway city, and partially belongs to the altar, and therefore it's the of natural causes. So what's the law with respect to the animals that have been consecrated on a higher degree of holiness? Where there, it does not belong at all to the person who made the offering, who made the consecration, because once it's consecrated, he completely relinquishes ownership. It belongs completely to the altar, and therefore, why shouldn't that be offered on the altar? It doesn't belong at all to the people of the castaway city. It's already been completely consecrated to the altar and belongs completely to the temple, without the original person who made the consecration retaining any ownership. So what's the law with those? Yiftu, it should get redeemed. That can be redeemed. Because according to Ir HaNidachas, the only reason why you can't offer this on the altar is because their original owners retain some ownership. And because the original owners retain some ownership, it ought to be destroyed with the rest of the property of the castaway city. But in the case of offerings or animals that have been dedicated to be kachim, higher degree of karbanos, higher degree of holiness in offerings, where the original owner does not retain any ownership, then if it doesn't retain any ownership, why can't it be offered? So the original animal can't be offered because it's disgraceful to the altar to be taking an actual animal that came from a castaway city. But if I'm redeeming it, the cash value belongs to who? Belongs to the altar. The original owners have retained no ownership. So what did you do with that? Give it to the altar. And thus, any animals that have been consecrated any animals from a castaway city, from members of a castaway city, that have been dedicated to be of a higher degree of holiness, offering of those higher degree of holiness offerings, and therefore it does not belong to the original owners at all, it only belongs completely and fully to the altar, to the temple, those can be redeemed, and then we can use that money to buy offerings for the temple. The Gemara therefore asks, the Gemara asks like this: the opening statement of our text was, animals consecrated to the altar die of natural causes. Money dedicated for upkeep of the temple, redeemed. Because that doesn't belong to the original owners, it belongs completely to the temple. Now, according to you, Ir HaNidachas, in that not all animals that are offered on the altar have to die of natural causes. Only animals that have been dedicated to lesser degree of the lesser degree of holy offerings are the ones that have to be let to die. If it was consecrated to be an offering of the higher degree of holiness, then it's redeemed. So according to Ir HaNidachas, you actually have two types of animals that were redeemed. One, animals that have been consecrated for the upkeep of the temple, as the Mishnah states, as the text states, and B, according to Ir HaNidachas, animals that have been dedicated to be of the higher degree of holiness offerings. If that's the case, today, the Mishnah should have stated so. The text should have stated, the Mishnah should have stated, when are we of the view that animals that have been consecrated to the altar are to die of natural causes? That's only if it's animals that have been consecrated to be of a lesser degree of holy offerings, and that's because the owners, the people who made the consecration, retain some ownership, in this case being people of the castaway city, and therefore the money cannot be used for the altar because it still belongs to that person who came from the castaway city. But the Mishnah should have stated, according to Ir HaNidachas, that if you made a consecration, if the people of the castaway city consecrated an animal to be dedicated on the higher degree of holiness, then it should be redeemed. In other words, according to Ir HaNidachas, where it's not all animals that are dedicated to the altar have to actually die of natural causes, but some of them, the ones dedicated on the higher degree of holiness, are to be redeemed, then still, why are you making this blanket statement that all animals that are dedicated to the altar should die of natural causes? It's not true. It's only some. And in the same way, you made a distinction between animals offered to the altar, consecrated to the altar, that have to die of natural causes, versus animals that have been dedicated to the upkeep of the temple, which that belongs completely to the temple, and therefore it should be redeemed. The money goes to the temple. Make that same distinction within the category of animals dedicated to the altar. If it's a higher degree of holy offering, then it can be redeemed and put on the altar because it always belonged to the altar. If it's a lower degree of holy within the offerings, then it's left to die because it still belongs partially to the original owners. So why not make this distinction within the actual text according to Ir HaNidachas, where the distinction exists, because we're following the view of Rabbi Levi. So it says the Gemara, Kivin dikachatos, shemeisu ba'ala, b'lamisa azla, like psikale. The Gemara says like this: even within offerings of the higher degree of holiness, which ordinarily belong completely to the altar, and therefore the owners retain no ownership, there is still one issue of an exception, namely a chatos, a sin offering. A sin offering is of the higher degree of holiness, but if the owners of a sin offering died, then that sin offering also has to be left to die. It's not redeemed and used for other thing. So here's an exception to the rule. Because in this case, where the the person who made the consecration are dying, right? This is a wicked person of a castaway city. He's being put to death. And this animal, now what happens to it? All other higher holiness consecrated animals get redeemed and the money goes to the temple because it never belonged to the owners. But there's an exception to that rule. The chatas, the sin offering, in this case, the owners of the sin offering, the person from the castaway city, is being put to death. And therefore that animal is not redeemed and money goes to the temple. It has to die always because sin offerings cannot be redeemed because it has its own rules. Therefore it's an exception within an exception. And because it's an exception within an exception, the Mishnah decided to leave it alone and not get into it. The text left it alone and not get into it. Sum total is, the opening statement of a Mishnah is, animals, according to Ir HaNidachas, animals that have been consecrated to the altar are left to die, only referring to animals that have been consecrated to be of the lesser degree of holiness of offerings, in that the owner still retains some ownership and therefore cannot be given to the altar, and it still cannot be destroyed with the rest of the property of the castaway city because it's been consecrated to the temple, and thus it's left to die. As for the higher degree of holiness animals, we're not talking about that here in this text. But what would the law be? The law would be that ordinarily any higher degree of holiness offering, because it always belonged to the temple and the owner doesn't retain any ownership, redeem it, money goes to the altar. With the exception of the sin offering, in that the sin offering, because the owners, in this case, the person who consecrated the animal dies, in this case being the person in the castaway city who's being put to death, that animal is left to die, it cannot be redeemed and used for the altar, even though the original owner does not retain any ownership, and even though, considering the fact that it is a offering of a higher degree of holiness. Okay, hope you're able to follow that back and forth. But let's get to the final statement on this discussion between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. The Gemara asks, the Gemara states, Bishlim Rabbi Yochanan, all is well according to Rabbi Yochanan. Le'amar Rish Lakish, he doesn't follow the words of Rish Lakish. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan was of the view that the reason why offering animals that have been consecrated to the altar, to be offerings in the altar, the reason why you cannot redeem it is because it originates from a wicked person, and the verse states that the offering of the wicked are repulsive. So he elects not to follow Rish Lakish, who said that the owners still retain some ownership, giving this complicated back and forth about animals that have half ownership because it's been consecrated to the temple, but the original owner still own ownership and therefore can't go either way. So Rabbi Yochanan doesn't follow that view because why should he? He has a straight verse. Tiksivi has a straight verse. The verse says that the offerings of the wicked are repulsive. So why should he get into a whole halachic conundrum and this like novelty of half ownership? It belongs partially to the temple because it's been consecrated, but it belongs partially to the original people who consecrated because they retain some ownership, and that if it were to die, they would replace it. Why get himself into this whole thick, complicated, convoluted discussion when the verse explains it? Why can't you give the money to the altar? Because it originates from a wicked person, and the offerings of the wicked are repulsive. That's what the verse says. So why get into a whole complicated thing? So that's clear. But Rish Lakish, my time Rabbi Yochanan. Why didn't Rish Lakish just say what Rabbi Yochanan said? Why did Rish Lakish invent this whole, or go through this whole complicated legal analysis to describe animals that have half ownership, partially belong to the altar, and part because it's been consecrated, but partially belong to the owners, the people, because they're responsible to replace it? Why get into that? Just quote the verse. The verse says the offerings of the wicked are repulsive, and that's why even money that was used to redeem those animals can't be brought in the altar because it originates from a wicked person. Just say that. Amalach. So the Gemara says no. Rish Lakish would respond no. The verse which says that the offerings of the wicked are repulsive, hani mili, is restricted only to hechad isna ba'inai, when you actually have the actual animal. Aval hacha. Kivan the ishtani, because the status of the animal changed, because it's gone, because the wicked is gone. I'm sorry, let me review that. When do we say that the offerings of the wicked are repulsive? That's when the wicked person is standing right there bringing the offering. But in this circumstance, where the wicked person is being put to death, given the ishtani, it changes. The wicked person is dead; he's gone. Where we're changing the money, we're changing the animal, and the animal's gone because we're exchanging it for cash. So even though it originated from the wicked person, Rish Lakish says that's not enough to make it say that it's an offering of the wicked which is repulsive. The wicked guy's not here, and the animal's not here. It's just the money from what that guy did once upon a time. So the verse itself, according to Rish Lakish, is not enough to say that the money that was used to redeem the animal cannot be used to the altar. And therefore, in order to explain why indeed is the case that this animal has to be left to die rather than redeeming it, he has to say the reason is because there is this partial ownership between the altar and the original person who made the consecration. A wonderful day, and hope that was somewhat clear.